Hi, Rebecca.
Hey, Mark. How are you?
Good. So this is Mark Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch and host of the Global Dispatches podcast, where we talk with great people like Rebecca. And I'm actually cross-posting this to the Global Dispatches podcast as well. So thanks so much for speaking with me today, Rebecca.
Pleasure. Always good to talk to you.
So why don't you introduce yourself? I know you're up to some pretty interesting things these days.
Yeah, so I'm at Columbia Law School, and I'm working on a research project on state-enabled crime, but I'm also teaching their LLM students, who are a fantastic group of lawyers from all over the world.
Excellent. And you are the author of an excellent book about U.S. policy towards Darfur in the mid-2000s as well.
Right.
Can't not plug that.
Exactly. Fighting for Darfur. You can still get it on Amazon.
Still, and it's great, and you should. So we're recording this. We're speaking not too long after South Sudan celebrated, although that's not the correct word, commemorated perhaps, its fourth Independence Day, right?
Right.
And things really could not be much worse in South Sudan right now. The proximate cause of this current round of war and conflict, of civil war and civil conflict in South Sudan, were events that could be traced to December 2013. So why don't you just kind of talk everyone through what happened in December 2013 that led to kind of the morass we're in today.
Okay. So I'm glad you said proximate cause, because there's a lot right behind that, right? But the proximate cause was essentially a leadership battle between two men. The president of South Sudan, Salva Kiir, and the man who had, until the middle of 2013, been his vice president, Riek Machar. These two men have extremely long histories, very fraught histories. And there was, earlier in 2013, Riek's decision that he would challenge Salva Kiir for the leadership of South Sudan. Salva Kiir preempted that by actually firing him from his vice presidency position. And I think to really understand the significance of that, you do have to understand a bit more about the history of these two men, because during the decades-long war between what is now Sudan and what is now South Sudan, but at the time was a unified Sudan, Salva Kiir was key within the leadership of the SPLM, which was headed by a man that a number of your listeners know, John Garang, the sort of founder of...
And the SPLM, you should say, it was like the main political and military movement for independence of South Sudan.
Right, was and remains so to this very day, which is one of the problems, in fact, in the current situation. Now, at some point, Riek Machar, who is also a southerner, defected from that SPLM movement, set off with his own rebel movement, and was responsible for many atrocities against civilians. And there's an ethnic dimension to this. Riek Machar is from the Nuer ethnic group. Salva Kiir is from the Dinka ethnic group. These are the two main ethnic groups in South Sudan, although there are very many more. So the idea at independence, by having a government that would have President Kiir, a Dinka, in the presidency, Vice President Riek Machar and Nuer as the vice president. It was sort of a coalition government in that sense against the history. So the idea that Salva Kiir would fire essentially Riek Machar brought to the forefront this history of animosity and all of the ethnic disputes that had never been properly resolved before independence, and led to a lot of fear out in the communities. I mean, this was all happening in the capital in Juba, but it filtered out throughout the communities across South Sudan of what did this mean? Did this mean that the Dinka were going to take over South Sudan? This is one of these sort of terrible rumors that you hear from time to time when people start to get nervous. And I think also related to it was the fact that people didn't yet trust the government, that they didn't yet trust that the government was there to protect them.
And probably for good reason,
right.
Because even, since independence, there had been, general lawlessness. Like the government has not been able to extend itself far beyond Juba, right?
That's exactly right. So it was a totally appropriate mistrust, and a mistrust that, as it turns out, has been unfortunately verified. So there was all this history, and what you had was finally the complete split and the breakaway between Riek Machar and his supporters and Salva Kiir. And in December 2013, we spoke soon after that, I'm sure. It looked like maybe this would be sort of a political or a leadership challenge that could be resolved at the negotiation table, but instead it just spiraled out and out and out. And all the old factions from during the long civil war reared their ugly heads once again.
And so now we're in a situation where there's something like 2 million people displaced, something like 100. This is actually kind of astonishing. Like 100,000 South Sudanese are now sheltered at UN bases. There's a pretty sizable UN contingent, UN peacekeeping contingent in South Sudan that's basically at this point it's not robust enough to go out and stop the fighting, but at least it's sort of sheltering civilians that are huddled in its camp, which is sort of an unusual.
I mean, it's actually it's incredible because that was not as part of their mission at all. This was not established as a protection of civilians mission, although query whether perhaps it should have been. But I think there's a lot of criticism to be made often of the UN. But this is a case where they've gone above and beyond, and they haven't been able to do it well because they were never established to do that in South Sudan. And they haven't had the supplies and the resources and the personnel to do a great job. But when faced with the choice of there are civilians who are outside our base camp and they're asking to be brought in for their own protection, do we keep the doors shut because that's what we don't have any sort of formal responsibility to do more right here and now, or do we open the doors in and do as good as we can? And that's what they've done. And I think the individuals on the ground who are working for the UN need to be applauded for that. That said, because these were never set up as displacement camps, the conditions there are far from what we would want if we were designing this from the bottom up.
So one thing I've been wanting to ask you is how the relationship between Salva Kiir and the United States government, the members of the Obama administration, have soured so dramatically so quickly. I mean, you had this great series around the time of South Sudan's independence, which did some really incredible reporting around how a pretty small cadre of, at the time, Obama administration officials really helped give birth and provided really important momentum behind South Sudan's independence. And some of these members are very high-ranking Obama administration officials. I mean, like Susan Rice, the National Security Advisor, or Gail Smith, who's about to lead USAID. But now the relationship between Salva Kiir and the Obama administration seems so sour. I saw this report, or I don't know if you saw it. There's this like YouTube video that Susan Rice made on the occasion of South Sudan's 4th anniversary, and where she just like laid into the guy that she was formerly championing. So what exactly happened, and how did this relationship turn so bad so quickly?
Okay, so I wanna sort of pick this apart a little bit. Say that
do.
The sort of champions of the independent South Sudan that you're talking about that I reported on in that Reuters piece, who very much include Susan Rice and Gail Smith, their history goes back 20 years. So I mean, yes, they're with the Obama administration now, but their commitment to South Sudan and the cause of South Sudan independence isn't. I wouldn't characterize it as having been an Obama administration position. That had been their personal position across every administration over the last sort of 2 decades. And the personal relationships there are extremely close. And I think it is entirely appropriate for Susan Rice to be taking the view of, we supported you, we believed in you, we helped you get the independence that you were after, and that you had always sold as, and she doesn't say this in so many words, but had always been sold as being able to differentiate yourself from the appalling governance and abuse of own citizens that was happening by the Sudanese government. Now, for you to get into power and then to be doing these same sorts of things against your own Southern Sudanese citizens, that was not the deal that they signed up for. And so, you can call that a souring of the relationship, totally appropriately so. And I think that she and others in that set would not be being good friends, as it were, to the people of South Sudan, unless they were calling out the Southern Sudanese leadership in the same way that they have called out the Sudanese leadership over time. Now, I'm distinguishing that group from President Obama himself, who simply never had that long history with South Sudan, and I haven't interviewed him directly, so I can't give you a sort of a personal read on that, but everything that I have spoken to other people about vis-a-vis him suggests that he didn't feel that same level of commitment to the new nation of South Sudan, not in that really deep way that the others who had followed it through the long civil war felt. And I think he was always, and perhaps more appropriately so, willing to just see Salva Kiir and others in the leadership play it out on the merits. And I think if they had made the right moves and really committed to solid governance structures and to really showing the people of South Sudan that their new government could be trusted, then he would have absolutely stayed on board with the project.
And there was this famous incident, right? I think it must have been 2010 or 2011 at the United Nations, right, where Salva Kiir had a special forum on South Sudan that Barack Obama attended during the UN Week, the General Assembly Summit, where he sort of caught Salva Kiir in a lie, right? That you probably know the details of this better than I do, but the gist is Salva Kiir said he didn't have troops somewhere where the U.S. satellite imagery proved that he did.
Right, and so that has been subsequently kind of noted as one of those kind of totem moments. You don't lie to President Obama. I think it just speaks generally to there not having been that long personal history between the two of them in the way that there
regardless
had been.
Though, yeah.
With
I mean, either way, I think, policy is largely driven by interests, not personalities. So at some point,
both.
Or both. Okay, well, we could have a theoretical debate. But at some point, though, Salva Kiir, or I think it's indisputable that Salva Kiir has behaved progressively more like a brutal autocrat.
Correct.
And more like, countries like Eritrea than he has like the Democrat that perhaps Susan Rice and others had wished he had become.
Yes.
So why has not the Obama administration or the United States government or the international community been able to constrain Salva Kiir's actions in any meaningful way or compel him to behave in a certain way? Right.
So, number one, they're trying, but coming at it late. So we're only this year, we're in 2015. This has been happening since 2013. Only this year are targeted sanctions starting to come online. So you had that earlier this month from the UN Security Council and separately from the US also. So targeted sanctions actually not just against what we might call Salva Kiir's side, so the government of South Sudan side, but also the Riek Machar contingent, which is now called the SPLM in opposition, SPLM-IO. So you are starting to see sanctions of individual leaders, but it's very late in the day. And I think neither side has yet hit the point where they are sure that they can't win this militarily. And I fear that having expanded to the point where now, as you say, we're heading towards 2 million displaced, it's very hard to start rolling back from that into sort of peacetime governance.
I guess it's like the freedom at which Salva Kiir seems to operate. Like here, for example, a few weeks ago, the government of South Sudan kicked out the UN's top humanitarian coordinator, this guy named Toby Lanzer, over some tweets he wrote about the deteriorating humanitarian situation in South Sudan. Not like horrible accusatory tweets, just pointing out how bad things are got, how it's on the precipice of famine. And they kicked him out of the country, which is not something that like a responsible government does. They don't just like revoke the visas of UN humanitarian personnel. He wasn't even a political guy. He was the guy trying to work the logistics of making sure that the World Food Program can get its aid to some far corner of the country.
Right. I mean, they are so far from being a responsible government right now. You can't even put them on that page. But the other aspect that is complicating all this is that this is not just about, what does the US think that it should do? And it has still, because of those personal connections, a large amount of leverage in the situation. But there are all the regional players also. And the AU in particular went forth and established its first commission of inquiry, which could have been a great thing. It looked at the atrocities that were being committed in South Sudan and was supposed to publicly release a report to start to bring some accountability to the situation. Instead, it decided that it would sit on that report. And so all efforts at accountability by other players in the system outside of the AU had kind of been put on hold while the Commission of Inquiry was happening, because it was like, okay, let's see the AU do its thing. It's taken responsibility. That's great. But now that the report hasn't been released, I think there is some question of, well, who takes the lead next? Do we just keep pushing for the AU to release the report? Does somebody else have to generate an independent report, that's separate from the AU? So I think that just figuring out who takes the lead has also been complicated on this one.
Another thing I want to ask you about is the question about how related is this situation, this conflict in South Sudan unfolding right now? How related is it to the political situation in Sudan proper, particularly the sort of the simmering conflict in Sudan, but in the Nuba region along the border with South Sudan?
Right. So yes, you can see it as almost three conflicts, or two overlapping conflicts, because there's everything that's happening inside of South Sudan. Then there's another set of conflicts happening inside Sudan. And then on either side, there are proxies, and the governments on either side are funding rebels on the other side. And so this whole thing is facilitated by these cross-border alliances. So you had, as you were heading into independence, let me back up a moment. During the long civil war, you had the SPLM, the main rebel party and future government party of South Sudan, operating all throughout Sudan, the unified Sudan. And when Sudan separated and became its own nation, there were still those people who were working in what was now Sudan and not South Sudan. They became the SPLM North, is what we call them. And they found common cause with the various rebels that had been targeting the Sudanese government, included...
Basically, like, they wished that they could have seceded as well, right?
Well, they would have... That's the people in the Nuba Mountains wanted some decentralized governance structure. The people working for the SPLM in the north just wanted to improve the governance structures in Sudan. If they were going to have to stay in Sudan, they didn't want to be part of South Sudan. These are northerners, but they wanted a better system of governance. And they had common cause in that respect with the Darfuri rebels, who had been fighting this cause for so many years. And they joined into an alliance called the SRF, the Sudan Revolutionary Front. There's a lot of acronyms here. The Sudan.
I'm following you. Yeah. I'm with you. I'm with you. Okay. There. Keep going.
So you have the Sudan Revolutionary Front, which is sort of a loose umbrella of groups, rebel groups inside Sudan, who get funding and support from the government of South Sudan in Juba, in part because of those alliances where they were formerly part of the SPLM. They fought with the South in the Long War. So you have Salva Kiir and the government of South Sudan supporting those rebel groups in the north. In turn, you have in the south Riek Machar's splinter from the government of South Sudan, which is the SPLM in opposition, SPLM-IO. They are getting support from the government in Khartoum, the Sudanese government. So both sides, the stakes continue to amp up because they're getting funding and support from the government on either side. So that's another dimension of that needs to be picked apart in order to bring the heat down on this conflict. You also have Uganda intervening on the side of the government of South Sudan and the rebels that it supports, which is a further complication.
So, and I guess another further complication is the question of oil exports, right? Like under the agreement in which South Sudan gained independence, it was supposed to export its oil through Khartoum or through Sudan, but that has ceased, right?
Well, that did cease, and then they managed in mutual self-interest to resume. But I was just reading, I'm just looking at the figures that I was reading this morning, from 250,000 barrels per day, that was the pre-conflict level. They're now down to 160,000 barrels a day. And particularly for the South Sudanese government, 90% of their revenue comes from oil. And they haven't put money into diversifying the economy. At the moment, they're in such conflict that they just don't have the capacity to be doing that anyway. But this in turn means that they can't do any of the things that would build the people's trust in the government, that would stop it being an attractive proposition for people to just go back to the ethnic militia groups that they know as a means of self-protection. So, all of this is tied up with every other part of it. But what is clear is that the foreign oil investors are very nervous about continuing operations in South Sudan. Some are pulling out, or they're removing their foreign workers from the situation. And neither the Southern Sudanese or even the Sudanese have enough of the technical expertise at this point to do it all themselves. So the conflict is having a huge impact on oil production.
So how is the government able to fund its war against Riek Machar?
So it's basically bankrupting itself into the future. It's pulling what it can from the existing oil reserves and trying to make contracts and negotiated agreements with investors on the future promise of profits. And just getting itself massively into debt, essentially, on that score. So it's highly irresponsible financially, in addition to all of the obvious humanitarian consequences.
So earlier you said that both sides at this point think that they can win on the ground, and that's been sort of that's undermined any prospects for negotiated peace settlements. And I know there have been these kind of fitful attempts at a peace agreement. So how do you see this playing out? How do you see the situation just sort of evolving over the next few months or years?
Honestly, I'm so pessimistic right now. We have another effort that's starting in early August, I think, to try once again to reach a peace agreement between the two sides. But as I think we've discussed this in an earlier conversation, the problems are so much bigger than the immediate political problem between Riek Machar and Salva Kiir. And the question really is, what is a new constitution for South Sudan going to look like? Is it going to be a multi-party constitution? Is there going to be a real commitment to democracy? And now with Salva Kiir having sort of bankrupted into the future South Sudan by using the oil money and the future oil money to wage this war, what is the basis for an economy going forward? So all of that looks pretty bleak. The thing that I would say on the plus side is this may be one of the very few crises in the world right now where the Security Council is actually quite united. Neither the US nor China want to see this conflict ongoing. It serves neither of their interests. And so it's one of those few places where the Security Council can actually come together and have a win by being on the one page. So that gives me some sense of hope. I do think there's a need to figure out at the global level who is taking what lead where, because you do have the AU in there as a player. You also have IGAD, the regional bloc that was so key in getting the 2005 Comprehensive Peace Agreement. They're in there as well. So there's a coordination problem at the global level, but at least there is not any core interests that are completely at loggerheads.
But then again, you can say that despite this high level of coordination at the international level, it's still a disaster.
No, I think there's not. I don't think there's enough coordination. I think what's great is that there are not not opposing interests.
Right. But I'm saying, like, as opposed to a situation like Syria, where the Security Council is horribly paralyzed, there is not that same sort of paralysis because, China, which you referenced earlier, I mean, even though they're a key importer of oil from the region, they're on generally the same side as the U.S. here.
Right. Look, I mean, yes, you're right. It's depressing that even when our interests are aligned, we still can't make progress.
Good. Well, I thank you so much, Rebecca, for putting this all in context and in focus.
Yeah. Can I just finish off with one more thing, Mark?
Yeah, please do.
Reflecting on this, because as you know, I've been very engaged on these issues for a number of years now, and it just seems as though and this is not just the lawyer in me speaking, although that may be part of it, we do continue to just push accountability down the track. We put accountability aside to get the peace agreement, to get the South Sudanese referendum. And there was always a thought, well, once the two countries are separate, then perhaps we can deal with accountability and responsibility for so many of the atrocities that happened during the Civil War. But it just keeps not happening. It's sort of never the right time. And yet, without there having been any resolution of those issues, we can't be surprised that there is so much mistrust and animosity at the local level and so much insecurity, so that when the leaders are not performing responsibly and sort of highlighting their better selves that could be there, that people do revert to old ethnically charged patterns and forms of protection.
And that failure of accountability probably starts at the top, right, with the failure of Bashir, who's indicted, the president of Sudan, who was indicted on war crimes charges many years ago from ever facing justice at the International Criminal Court and seemingly evading it at every turn.
Right. But at least, we have an arrest warrant out for him. There's been some process. In South Sudan, there's been no process yet. So I think that is on the agenda for the coming years.
Well, thank you.
All right. Thanks, Mark. Great to talk to you.
All right. Okay.